Now I'm going to go ahead and skip forward because I want to get my other quotation. And we're assuming here that in your case, you have actually written out the full quotation. Again, I have not because I don't necessarily want you copying my work. I just want to illustrate that those quotations are there and how to use them. So at this point, I'm going to go on and I'm going to go ahead and write my rebuttal claim so that I can select a quotation that they're using. And what that's going to do is that is going to ensure that I have both of my texts. So, and I'll illustrate that here in a minute. So for my rebuttal, I need to acknowledge the other side. I'm going to tell why they're wrong within the first sentence. So I said, some people argue that state licensing laws for 16-year-olds are effective at making them better drivers than 18-year-olds who face fewer restrictions. But the reality is that a higher driving age, in addition to licensing laws for all new drivers, would result in safer drivers overall. I want to point to the fact that 16-year-olds have a lot of licensing restrictions that are involving them in fewer car crashes. On page 256, there's a statistic here that says that 1,348 fewer fatal crashes involve 16-year-old drivers, while the number of 18-year-old drivers involved in fatal crashes has increased. And it talks about how the more rigorous licensing process has led to that drop in rate, whereas 18-year-old drivers don't have to face those restrictions and they don't have to go through classes, so they're not as well prepared to drive. My argument is that the fact that the rigorous restrictions are causing the rate of 16-year-olds to crash at a far lesser rate, what it suggests is that maybe we should raise the driving age to 18 due to that brain research that I talked about in my first paragraph. But then rather than letting 18-year-olds just go willy-nilly on the road without having to take classes, maybe all new drivers should be required to go through all of the steps that those 16-year-old drivers have to go through. That would ultimately result in far fewer crashes overall, because in my first paragraph, I've talked about how as teens get older, their brains become more developed and they start to make better decisions. And then if we added to that, that they have to go through the same licensing laws that those 16-year-olds went through, that their rate would drop even more significantly. Okay, so that is going to be my argument for my second paragraph, or my counter argument rather, because I'm quoting from page 256. I'm quoting those statistics, but I'm also going to go back to my other article here, and I want to quote from page 248. At the top of 248, there is a quotation there that talks about how one 16-year-old's brain might be more developed than another 18-year-old's brain. But in that paragraph, it goes on to say that there's evidence that's mounting that a 16-year-old's brain is generally far less developed than those of teens just a little older. And so I'm going to want to quote from that article as well. The fact that they tend to generally be far less developed than those just a little bit older contributes to my argument, because that means that an 18-year-old's brain is slightly more developed. And so even if there are varying rates of development in kids' brains, overall, we have the 18-year-olds. It seems like their brains are further along. So that'll help me make my argument, or my counter argument, in the second paragraph so that I can refute the other side of the story. Okay? And I want to point something out to you here, because we've accomplished one task and we haven't even done anything beyond writing our claims and quoting from our texts. And so we do want to add to that, but first let's take a look at our rubric. So we're focusing on the 3 meeting standard. By all means, you should shoot for the stars if you want to focus on the 4 exceeding standard response. But really all we need to do here is we need to meet the standard. So I'm going to look through here and draw your attention to some key ideas in this rubric that we want to accomplish. Okay, so in the first bullet point here, we need text-based ideas to support analysis or conclusions drawn from 2 texts. Okay, so I've accomplished that in my response. The first 2 quotes come from "Is 16 too young to drive?" In my second paragraph, one of my quotations comes from fatal car crashes drop for 16-year-olds. And one of my quotations, my counter argument, it comes from a 16 too young to drive. I've accomplished the goal of quoting from both of those articles there. Okay, so text base, two texts. I want to make sure that I'm fully addressing the prompt, so let's go up and read that. Our central question is 16 too young to drive a car? Okay. In that, I need to make a claim about whether 16 is too young to drive a car. I've done that. I've included specific textual details, evidence, so I've done that, an explanation of how these details support your claim, which is the reasoning. And I haven't done that yet, but I certainly plan to. So I can say that I'm on a trajectory to be able to accomplish that task. In addition, I want to note that I must include a rebuttal of the opposing view in order to meet the standard. So I've got to bring up one of their points and argue against it. And that's what I've started in that second paragraph. So I'm well on my way to fully addressing this prompt, and all I need to really do is explain and elaborate to provide that reasoning so that I can prove that my quotations support my claim and that I'm right. Okay? Cite sufficient evidence from two different texts, and I need two or more specific relevant quotations. I've accomplished that. Okay, so I've cited from both of the texts. I've chosen to cite some brain research, and I've chosen to cite some statistics. So those are both specific and they're relevant. And I've done quoting, so I've accomplished that. I've done two quotations in my first paragraph, and I was able to do two quotations in my second paragraph, so I've exceeded that. I've done two or more specific relevant quotations to get myself well on my way to a strong argument. And then finally, adequately elaborates ideas and reasons using precise language. That's one that I haven't done yet. I have used precise language in my claims, but now I need to go in, and this is where I need to add the explanation. It's where I need to elaborate to provide reasoning to prove that my quotations support my claim. And so that is what you would do next. I'm going to go ahead and end this video here since we've accomplished the task of starting our draft. We did that by, first, we figured out what those two texts said, what their main ideas were. We decided which argument we were going to make. Then we created a claim that told us both the answer to the question, 16 is too young to drive, and gave the main reason that I'm going to argue in my first paragraph, which is that their brains aren't developed enough. I have found myself two quotations to support that argument. And in your case, you would have already typed these quotations in. Then I've crafted a claim for my rebuttal paragraph in which I acknowledge the other side's argument, but I tell why they're wrong. I want to acknowledge their argument, but then I want to quickly switch back around to saying, here's what they're not thinking about. Here's what the reality is, so that I can knock their argument down. And then finally, I have included a quotation that they're using, and that's important to do because I want to make sure that I quote from the second article. You'll recall that on the benchmark writing rubric, in order to get a 3, I've got to quote from two different texts. If I only quote from one of the texts, like this here, it just says text. If I only quote from one of the texts, the highest I can get is approaching that standard. So I want to make sure that I quote from both the texts. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and release you so that you can add your interpretation and explanation after each quotation. And then in your final sentence for each paragraph, you're going to provide reasoning to bring everything full circle back to the claim and tell us how your evidence supports your claim, or in essence, how your evidence proves your claim and convinces your audience that you're right. So in a nutshell, that is how you begin drafting an argument to at least meet the standard on the SBAC rubric.